The elevator doors close at 11:47 p.m. and she is alone, and the camera is watching, and she will never walk out of that hotel the same way she walked in. And somewhere above her, in the black water tank on the roof, something is already waiting, and the world has no idea that in a few days everything about this moment will be studied and replayed and debated and wept over by millions of people who never met her and never will. And the doors open and close and open and close, and she presses buttons she should not need to press, and she leans out into the hallway and looks left and looks right, and her hands move in ways that haunt every single person who has ever watched that footage. And then she disappears, and the elevator closes, and the world goes quiet, and Elisa Lam is gone. Her name was Elisa Lam. Say it out loud. Elisa Lam. She was 21 years old, and she had a laugh that her friends described as something that filled her room before she even entered it. And she kept a Tumblr blog where she wrote about books and travel and the small, beautiful, aching things that sensitive people notice when the rest of the world is too loud to pay attention. And she had plans, and she had dreams, and she had a backpack and a camera and a burning desire to see the American West Coast one city at a time on what she called her solo trip of a lifetime. And she was from Vancouver, British Columbia, and she had bipolar disorder, which she spoke about with a courage that most people twice her age could never summon, because she believed in radical honesty, and she believed the world was worth exploring, even when her own mind made the exploring difficult. And she checked into the Cecil Hotel in downtown Los Angeles on January 26, 2013, and she smiled at the front desk and paid for her room and took the elevator up, and nobody at that desk had any idea they were looking at someone they would never see alive again. The Cecil Hotel sits on Main Street in downtown Los Angeles, and if buildings could carry sin the way skin carries scars, then the Cecil would be covered from foundation to rooftop in wounds that never healed. It opened in 1927, and from almost its very first decade, it began collecting the kind of history that polite people do not talk about at dinner. It was built during the Great Depression, and it sits in a neighborhood called Skid Row, and for nearly a century, it has been the last address of the desperate and the dying and the disappeared. Serial killers slept in its rooms. Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, who murdered 13 people across California in the 1980s, lived in the Cecil for months and would return from his killings and walk through the lobby with blood on his clothes, and the staff say nobody noticed or nobody said anything, and both possibilities are equally terrifying. Jack Unterweger, an Austrian serial killer, stayed at the Cecil while posing as a journalist covering crime in Los Angeles, and murdered 3 women while he was there, and the irony is so dark it barely feels real. The hotel had seen suicides and overdoses and murders and bodies discovered in rooms days after the dying happened, and the walls of that place had absorbed so much human suffering that some people who worked there said they could feel it in the air, like humidity, like something thick and invisible pressing against your skin when you walk the halls alone at night. Elisa Lam was staying in a room on an upper floor, and in the first few days she was fine, and she went out and she explored and she sent messages, and she was the kind of traveler who found wonder in everything and documented it with the specific tenderness of someone who understood that moments don't last, and that's exactly what makes them worth saving. She had been there less than a week when the hotel asked her to move from a shared room to a private room because her roommates had complained about her behavior. And this detail sits in the story like a small cold stone, heavy with implication and mystery. Because what behavior exactly? And what did they see? And were they frightened? And was she frightened? And we don't know. And we may never know. And that uncertainty is its own kind of horror. On February 1st, 2013, Elisa Lam was reported missing. Her parents in Vancouver had not heard from her. The calls were not being answered. The check-ins that she always made with her family had stopped. Her Tumblr went silent the way a heartbeat goes silent. And the people who followed her blog noticed immediately, because her voice online was so distinct and so alive that its absence felt physical, felt like a change in pressure, felt like the moment before something terrible becomes real. Her parents contacted the Los Angeles Police Department, and the search began, and the Cecil Hotel was searched, and her room was searched, and nothing was found, and Elisa Lam was simply not there, and the city of Los Angeles is enormous, and the possibilities were endless, and the police were doing what the police do, which is follow the logical thread. But the logical thread in this case led nowhere, because nothing about what happened to Elisa Lam was logical. The LAPD released the elevator surveillance footage on February 14th, 2013, Valentine's Day, which is a detail that feels both meaningless and unbearably cruel depending on your emotional state when you process it. And the footage immediately spread across the internet with a speed that suggested the collective human nervous system recognized something deeply wrong before the rational mind could articulate what it was seeing. The footage is black and white and grainy, the way only hotel security cameras of that era could be. And it shows an elevator, and it shows Elisa Lam, and it shows 4 minutes. And the 4 minutes are among the most disturbing 4 minutes ever captured on film. Not because of what happens, but because of the specific texture of what happens, the quality of the strangeness, the way it sits just slightly outside the boundaries of anything you can fully explain. She enters the elevator. She presses multiple buttons. She presses them with the deliberate, focused energy of someone trying to make something work, and it is not working. She waits. The doors do not close. She steps out into the hallway and presses herself flat against the wall beside the elevator, as if she is hiding from something in the elevator itself, or hiding herself from something in the hallway. She does not want to see her, and she peers around the corner with the careful, terrified energy of prey, and what she is looking at we cannot know, because the camera only shows the elevator and the immediate hallway, and whatever she saw or thought she saw is lost to the angle and the darkness beyond the frame. She goes back inside. She presses more buttons. She steps out again. She looks both ways. She moves her hands, and this is the part, these hands, this gesture, because her hands move in front of her in a way that is difficult to categorize. Not quite waving, not quite reaching, somewhere between sign language and sleepwalking and something that has no name yet. And her fingers splay and curl, and the movements are fluid and strange and deeply unsettling in a way that bypasses intellectual analysis and goes straight to the part of you that is ancient and animal and knows when something is not right. The elevator doors keep opening and closing behind her as if they are breathing, as if the elevator itself is alive and waiting. She walks away down the hallway. She does not come back into frame. The elevator doors close for the last time, and the hallway is empty. And the footage ends, and the world is left with questions that multiply like shadows in a dark room, 1 becoming 2, becoming 4, becoming an infinite corridor of unanswered things. Within days of the footage being released, millions of people had watched it. Forums erupted, Reddit threads stretched for thousands of posts, YouTube videos analyzing each frame, frame by frame, accumulated millions of views. Paranormal investigators and true crime researchers and armchair detectives and professional behavioral analysts all watched the same footage and came to different conclusions, and the only thing they agreed on was that something was profoundly, irreducibly wrong with what they were seeing. Some said her behavior indicated a psychotic episode, a bipolar manic break dissociated from reality. Some said she was playing a game, hide and seek, with someone who was never caught on camera, someone standing just outside the frame, someone the hotel's camera system could not or did not capture. Some said she was on drugs. Toxicology would later complicate that theory significantly. Some said she was already being controlled or influenced by something external, and they meant that in ways both rational and deeply irrational. And some people, a lot of people, more people than the rational mind is comfortable acknowledging, said she was being followed by something that cameras don't easily capture, something that exists at the edge of what we understand about reality. And they said this not from ignorance, but from the specific, desperate logic of people who have exhausted every other explanation and found it wanting. 19 days after she was reported missing, on February 19th, 2013, guests at the Cecil Hotel began complaining about the water. The water pressure was low. The water tasted strange. The water looked dark. One guest said it tasted like it had something in it. Another said the color was not right. A maintenance worker named Santiago Lopez was sent to check the rooftop water tanks, the large black tanks that provided water to the entire building. And he climbed the ladder and he opened the tank, and what he found inside that tank destroyed something in him that never fully recovered, because floating in the water, in the black water that had been flowing into the hotel showers and sinks and drinking glasses for days, was the body of Elisa Lam. Stop. Sit with that. The guests had been drinking that water. They had been showering in it. They had been brushing their teeth with it for days, and nobody knew. And the water had tasted wrong and looked dark, and people had noticed and complained, and the answer to their complaints was inside a sealed tank on the roof. And the horror of that is not just about death, it is about the specific violation of it. The intimate, terrible way that her death had been unknowingly shared with everyone in that building, dissolved into their daily lives without consent, and there is no clean way to process that, and no framework that makes it less awful. The tank was sealed from the outside with a latch. The hatch required effort to open. The roof was supposed to be locked. The ladder to the tanks was not easy to access. The question that the Los Angeles County Coroner and the LAPD and every investigator who ever looked at this case had to confront was simple and impossible simultaneously. How did Elisa Lam get into that tank? And who, if anyone, put her there? And if no one put her there, how did she get herself inside a sealed tank on a locked roof and then close the hatch above her from inside? This question has never been satisfactorily answered. It sits in the center of this case like a black hole, pulling every theory and every explanation into itself and collapsing them under the weight of its own impossibility. The Los Angeles County Coroner released their findings. The cause of death was accidental drowning. The manner of death was ruled accidental. Her toxicology showed the presence of her prescribed medications and no evidence of illegal drugs or substances that would explain the behavior in the elevator footage in any straightforward way. There were no signs of sexual assault. There were no signs of a struggle. There were no defensive wounds. There was nothing under her fingernails. There was no evidence that anyone else had been in or near that tank. The coroner said accidental, and a large portion of the world that had been watching this case said that does not make sense, and meant it with the specific frustrated grief of people who have watched the footage and seen the tank and heard the details and understand that accidental does not explain the geometry of what happened, does not explain the hatch, does not explain the roof access, does not explain the elevator, does not explain the hands. The elevator. Go back to the elevator, because the elevator is where this case lives, is where it breathes, is where it refuses to die. The footage was time-stamped, and the timestamp had a flaw that investigators noticed immediately. The footage appeared to be slightly time-delayed, slightly off from real time, which is common in security systems of that era, but the exact degree of the delay was never publicly specified with precision, which meant that the behavior captured on film could not be pinned to an exact moment with the certainty that investigators needed and the public demanded. The elevator door malfunction, the doors that kept opening and closing and refused to close properly while Elisa was there, was investigated, and the building's security footage showed that the elevator doors had been functioning normally before and after that incident, which means either the doors malfunctioned only during those specific minutes, or something specific to that situation caused the malfunction, and the building engineers were never able to identify a mechanical cause for what the footage showed. There is a detail that the paranormal community seized on with both hands, and the rational world tried to dismiss, but found more difficult to dismiss than expected. The Cecil Hotel had been featured in a horror film. In 2005, a Japanese horror movie called Dark Water told the story of a woman whose body was discovered in a rooftop water tank, a tank that had been contaminating the building's water supply. And the similarities to the Elisa Lam case are precise enough to be disturbing, regardless of your beliefs about the supernatural. There was also a survival horror video game called Limbo, released in 2010, in which the opening sequence involves an elevator and a girl in darkness and disappearance. And the game had gained significant cultural attention in the years before Elisa's death, and she had mentioned it on her Tumblr. These connections are not evidence of anything, but they are the kind of connections that accumulate in a case like this and create a texture of wrongness that pure rational analysis struggles to smooth away. The water tank itself was examined and measured. Elisa Lam, who was small, who was slender, who was 21 years old and had not been an athlete, would have had to climb a ladder on the outside of the tank, lift a hatch that weighed approximately 30 pounds, climb inside the tank while supporting the hatch above her, and then close the hatch from inside. The water inside the tank was 4 feet deep. The tank itself was over 8 feet tall. The ladder on the outside was the only way up. The roof door leading to the tank area was supposed to be locked and alarmed. When police investigated, the door's alarm status during the relevant time period was never conclusively established. The hotel security footage of the roof area was never publicly released. The hotel has never explained why. These absences of information are not evidence of conspiracy, but they are evidence of incompleteness, and incompleteness in a death investigation is its own category of failure. Elisa's parent, David and Elisa Lam, flew to Los Angeles, and they stood in a city that had swallowed their daughter, and they tried to understand something that was not built to be understood, and there are no words sufficient to the task of describing what that is like. To fly toward the last known location of someone you love, and know that you are flying not toward them, but toward the place where they ended, and toward the questions that will never stop asking themselves inside you for the rest of your life. They sued the Cecil Hotel. The lawsuit was settled. The terms were confidential. The questions remained. The internet never stopped watching. Years after Elisa Lam's death, her Tumblr was still active in a specific heartbreaking way, because she had scheduled posts, had used the queuing feature to schedule her writing in advance, and for months after her death her words kept appearing on schedule, her voice kept arriving in people's feeds, her observations about books and beauty and the specific difficulty and wonder of being alive kept being published automatically into a world that now knew she was gone. And the effect of that? The effect of receiving messages from someone you know is dead, messages they wrote before they knew they were dying, messages arriving like letters from a ghost who did not know they were a ghost yet. That effect is something that several of her followers described as one of the most quietly devastating experiences of their digital lives. A tuberculosis outbreak occurred in the Skid Row neighborhood around the time of Elisa's death. The test used to screen for tuberculosis, one of the standard diagnostic tests, was named Lam Elisa. The name is a coincidence, and the medical community is clear on this, but the specific configuration of those letters, that name, in that neighborhood, at that time, was noticed by people paying attention and added another layer of uncanny resonance to a case already drowning in it. Drowning, that word. It keeps arriving uninvited. There was a musician who had released an album called Sad Girl and had used the name Lam as part of a musical project and had released music that seemed to reference themes connected to the Cecil Hotel case before the case was widely known, and this musician received intense and frightening online. The harassment from people who became convinced the coincidences were not coincidences, and the harassment campaign was a reminder that the internet's engagement with true crime can become something that creates new victims in its hunger to understand the original one, and Elisa Lam would not have wanted that, and we know this because we know what kind of person she was, and we have read what she wrote, and she was someone who believed in kindness with the specific, fierce conviction of people who understand from personal experience exactly how much it costs when kindness is absent. Her blog. Go back to her blog because her blog is where she lives now in the most complete way available to us. She wrote about Virginia Woolf and about the specific loneliness of being in a crowd and about the way certain songs feel like weather and about bipolar disorder with the clarity and lack of self-pity that her readers found transformative, and she wrote about travel and about the courage it takes to go somewhere alone and not know what you will find. And she wrote at one point about not being afraid of the dark and about how darkness is just light that hasn't arrived yet. And that sentence lives differently now, reads differently now, carries a weight now that it could not have carried when she wrote it, because she wrote it not knowing she would end in darkness in a water tank on a hotel roof. And we read it knowing exactly that, and the distance between what she knew, what we know, is the specific anatomy of tragedy. Paranormal investigators visited the Cecil Hotel. They brought equipment designed to measure electromagnetic fields and temperature variations and audio anomalies, and they came away with recordings and readings they could not fully explain and chose to interpret in different ways, according to their existing frameworks, and this is true of everyone who has ever engaged with this case, that every person brings their framework and the case absorbs it, and the case remains unchanged and unresolved, and the framework reveals more about its holder than it does about Elisa Lam's death. The Cecil Hotel eventually rebranded and tried to leave its history behind in the way that buildings sometimes try to leave histories behind by changing names and painting over and bringing in new furniture, and the history stayed anyway, because history does not require permission to remain. The last known footage of Elisa Lam alive is the elevator footage. There is no footage of her on the roof. There is no footage of her entering the water tank. There is no footage that explains the gap between the elevator and the tank. And the gap is not metaphorical. It is literal and physical and spatial. And it is in that gap that every theory lives and every explanation fails and every sleepless night of wondering begins. She was there, and then she was not there. And then she was somewhere that she could not have gotten to alone, or could not have gotten to in any way that leaves evidence. And the evidence says she got there somehow. And the somehow remains the hardest word in the English language when applied to this, the specific case. What do we owe the dead? We owe them the truth when we can find it and when we cannot find it. We owe them the honesty of saying we cannot find it rather than manufacturing certainty to comfort ourselves. We owe them the work of remembering them as people rather than puzzles. We owe Elisa Lam the acknowledgement that she was a 21-year-old woman from Vancouver who loved books and travel and her family, and who had the specific, vulnerable courage of someone managing a serious mental health condition while still choosing to go out into the world and be in it fully. And she deserved to come home from that trip, and she deserved to grow older, and she deserved the ordinary, miraculous continuation of a life that was just beginning to understand itself. And she did not get any of that, and the reasons why remain to this day. A sealed hatch over a dark water tank on a roof that the cameras did not watch. The elevator doors open. She steps inside. She presses the buttons. The doors will not close. She steps out. She looks. She moves her hands in a way that no one has ever fully explained. She walks away. The camera watches the empty hallway. The city outside is dark and enormous, and full of the sound of traffic and sirens and ordinary human noise. Inside the Cecil, the water is running through the pipes. On the roof, the tanks are still and sealed and black against the night sky. Somewhere in the gap between the footage and the finding, in the 19 days of winter silence, in the dark water and the locked roof and the impossible hatch, something happened and we do not know what it was, and we may never know. And that unknowing is a door that never fully closes, that swings open at 3 a.m. when the house is quiet, and you are alone with the footage playing in the dark of your mind, and you watch her hands move again, and you ask again the question that has no answer. She was there, and then she was not, and the elevator keeps opening and closing, and the water keeps running, and her words keep arriving on schedule into a world she left behind. And the question that will stay with you tonight, that will follow you into sleep and surface in the hours before dawn, when the rational mind relaxes its grip and the other kind of knowing takes over. The question is this: what was she looking at in that hallway? What was she hiding from? What did she see that the camera could not? And was she alone? This is Crime Crypt. Lock your doors tonight. If this story reached somewhere inside you that you did not expect to be reached, subscribe, because the truth is always darker than the story you think you know, and we are just getting started.